The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, I'll start in a second or two. I'm just waiting for a few more people to join. We've got over 100 people on the call, but I know there are a lot more people trying to get in the lobby. So I'll just be 1 or 2 minutes and then I'll be right back with you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start. We are going to record this and we can email you a recording of it afterwards if you've arrived late or you need to leave early, but I'll try and get through this in half an hour. It's the first of a series of webinars that Ipsos Mori will be running, looking at different aspects of the crisis, what might change, and other things that we think our clients and friends will find interesting. If you want to email me directly with any questions, email ben.page@ipsos.com. You can tweet along if you agree or disagree with it, and we'll also send you copies of the slides in due course. So to start with, I think the first thing is I'm going to be making predictions about the future, and it is worth remembering before I do that of course most predictions are wrong. This is economists making predictions of American 10-year Treasury rates. The blue line going down and down shows what actually happened. The coloured lines show their predictions between 1996 and 2015 each few years, and as you can see, they are broadly consistently wrong. The public as a whole are generally wrong. When we asked people last year, just a few months before the virus took off in China, we asked people what they thought the biggest threats to their health were, and this is from the Global Trends survey that we're talking about today, and we had most people very worried about things like cancer, things like pollution. Very few people worried about infectious diseases like COVID-19, flu or malaria. So most predictions are wrong. Of course, opinion pollsters are right, but we usually have to wait to a few days before a general election to give you very detailed predictions about what's going to happen. And most of the time, people are wrong. So when we talk about what's going to happen, we of course have to admit that nobody knows what will happen in the future, but there are signs that we can pick on that we think give us some good indicators. So the first of these, what we're doing with this study is to take 370 questions asked of over 22,000 people, and in half an hour, I'm not going to try and show you all those. You'll be pleased to know it covers 33 countries. You can compare China with Montenegro, or France with Britain, or Mexico with Peru if you want to. But I think first of all, it's just to acknowledge that if we're looking at the future, it's to think about the macro forces that face us. These are the known knowns. So we know that demography is destiny. We know that Europe, with or without COVID-19, is on course to be the oldest region in the world. We know that there will be no more Italians than in about 170 years if they don't start to raise their birth rate. We know there will be more Nigerians than Americans in fairly short order. So population is one of the known knowns. Also, of course, growing inequality and opportunity, and COVID-19, I think, will fall most heavily on particular communities. Much of the upheavals in our politics in the West has been caused by growing inequality and also reactions to that. We don't see any change there. Geopolitical tensions, we've moved from a world of the late 20th century built around the Washington Consensus and multilateralism. We go into COVID-19 and the recovery period with, China versus America, the United States versus everybody else, with Europe versus Russia, and a world that's much more like the mid-Victorian period in some ways than perhaps the world many of us have grown up with. I don't need to talk to all of you about data, but there's more of it than ever, of course, and how that plays out, we'll see, but it has huge implications in terms of how we deal with COVID-19, but also, of course, our societies as a whole. And then I think one thing we should all look out for is technology tipping points. And we single this out because it's where one technology combines with another or several technologies to create something entirely new. So, for example, to create the Uber taxi service, you need to invent satellites and have global positioning satellites. You need to invent the internet. You need to invent the smartphone. You need to do some really clever stuff with radio and miniaturization. But you put all those things together and suddenly you have a massively disruptive service that couldn't have existed without any one of those things. So how this all plays out, of course, is something to keep looking for. And then finally, the planet we actually inhabit. Even before COVID-19, we had, of course, more concern about climate change than ever, which I want to come to. We had fires in Australia, flooding all over Europe, and of course, COVID-19 itself is often said to be, a warning sign of pandemics that may become a sort of more routine thing. If you listen to Bill Gates back in 2015, of course, he said it's the one thing we weren't prepared for. And of course, it's likely, according to many experts, that viruses like COVID-19 might become more common as our ecosystems come under more and more pressure, because simply we are interacting with animals more and more as we destroy their environments. So either way, and global warming can possibly make the spread of these diseases faster. So we know these are the known knowns, and we need to put human opinions in the context of these macro forces. Now, our theory of change includes COVID-19. We know that there are macro forces that act on human society and create the trends that we often measure in our research. And then there are signals that we can see all around us, which of course are changing very rapidly at the moment. I mean, to give you an example of how this might work, you can see a macro force like climate change leading to a lot more people becoming interested in plant-based diets, thinking about the methane emitted by livestock and the costs to the environment of raising animals. And then, of course, we have signals, which in Britain would be Greggs offering consumers a vegan, plant-based sausage roll. So that's our theory of how these things interact with each other. COVID-19, of course, is a massive shock to that ecosystem, and it's playing out all across it. What we don't yet know, of course, is what changes and what doesn't change. We can see an absolute tsunami of signals. You can see people changing shopping hours for older people. I'm now doing the shopping for my 70-year-old neighbour. Will I keep doing that afterwards? Don't know. Let's think about it. New ways to greet people. You have balcony bingo. We have everybody going on their doorsteps in Britain at 8 o'clock on Thursdays to bang pots and pans and whistle for the National Health Service. We've got exercise classes online. We've got escapism. You've got free Pornhub premium for everybody in lockdown. Massive growth of gaming in China and indeed in Europe as it went into lockdown. Xbox crashed online because the demand was so high. We've got all sorts of new confrontations. The idea that, of course, it's just a Chinese invention. It was brought out in a lab, and indeed 25% of the British population believe that it was created in a laboratory. Attack on people like me. Boomers care, but not about the planet. The idea that from the Gen Zs, that people like me have destroyed the planet, but of course, I'm now going to be destroyed by the virus, and it's sort of justice. We have bad science, people attacking 5G masts, including the ones outside the NHS Nightingale Hospital in London, because 5G causes COVID-19. If I tell you nothing else on this presentation, it's certainly that 5G does not cause COVID-19, and we can be 100% certain about that. But certainly, this idea that it's all a conspiracy, etc., certainly has an audience. So those are the signals that we can see. And actually, as you will see at the end, we are now mapping out these signals, all of the ones that we see around us, to try and look for signs of what might be coming. In the survey, we mapped 170 different questions into about 36 different values, remember. And what we can do is use these values to look at where we might see change starting to happen. So if and what's interesting is this factor analysis groups these together. So you can see that beyond binary over here is a very long way away from traditional gender roles. But it's interesting if we look here, you've got a group of values down here, often those perhaps of some of the Brexit voters, some of the people in the flyover states in America, some of the Gilets jaunes, people who feel left behind, who feel nostalgic for the past, feel overwhelmed, interested in a populist revolution, and also afraid of the fear of the future. On the other side over here, perhaps some of the people on this call, you've got the sort of values of hedonism, positive about technophilia, like technology, early adopters, probably believe that capitalism and medicine sort of broadly work, despite their weaknesses. Down here, a cluster of values more closed and conservative around traditional, whether that's in terms of traditional gender roles, men know their place, women have their place, traditional nationalism, my country right or wrong, and people who are tired. It's interesting that close to those is tired of environmentalism. It's all a con, but also into materialism and achievement. And they're a long way away from over here, and often the values of some younger people, beyond binary. This group, this value is all about very, very strongly committed to gender equality, but also to trans rights, to LGBT rights, and also believing that there are more than two genders. There may be two sexes, but there are a lot more than two genders. And that's closest, if anything, to people who are very concerned about climate emergency. In the middle of the chart is the sort of more mainstream stuff around sort of individualism, conscious eating, discerning consumption. We called this sort of grouping here conscious consumption. But it's interesting to see how global values map out. And the further, as I say, the further apart things are, the less likely people are to share the two values. It doesn't mean to say that there won't be a trans activist who doesn't believe in environmentalism, but it's less and less likely. So those are the 36 global values. They group together into 12 trends. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. If you want another webinar where we do let us know. But you can see that when we were trying to make sense of this for reporting, to produce a 100-page report, which you can download free of charge on our website, and I'll give you the link at the end, you can see that we've got climate antagonism, which is, of course, environmentalism plus the reaction against it, conscientious health. I think it does what it says on the tin. A key one for many brands, authenticity is king. The sense of provenance, brand purpose, discerning consumption, all grouped together. Two around data and the tech dimension, and we have both rising apathy and in some ways anxiety, and I want to talk about that. Peak globalization does what it says on the tin. A divided world over those battles over things like trans rights, which is in there as beyond binary. Capitalism's turning point. Are we at this point, even before COVID-19 led to massive state intervention? We could see that one of the strongest values on the planet is actually the idea of wealth redistribution, that wealth inequality is a bad thing, that we need to increase taxes on wealthy people, and an idea that the system is somehow rigged in favor of the rich and powerful. And 3/4 of people on the planet agree with that. And then because of all of these pressures, you have reactions to inequality and uncertainty, which can lead to left-wing populism, right-wing populism, a retreat to tradition, or indeed, as you've seen, the enduring appeal of nostalgia, which is a trend that we've been observing accelerating since 2008. But this, if you're unhappy and anxious about the present and the future, the past becomes a more and more attractive place. Another reaction is the search for simplicity and meaning train, where you just feel overwhelmed and want to simplify your life. And finally, choices over healthcare, and we certainly face some massive, massive choices. It's unlikely that our healthcare systems are going to stay unchanged after we've come out of this system. And indeed, how we think about our own health may well change as a result of our sort of consciousness of it during this period. But I think the key point when we're looking at trends, the key thing is that even with a shock like COVID-19 and a dramatic change in all of our lifestyles, it often takes much longer to shift underlying trends and macro forces before we arrive at possibly a new normal. And if this is going to be what I see as an L-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery, we will be in a transition period for some time. But I think because what we're measuring in research, of course, is both opinions, which are often on the surface, they're quite shallow, they change very fast. We've got the attitudes, which are a bit like currents. Those are deeper and stronger. They don't switch overnight. And then finally, there is perhaps what we've called values, the deep tide of the public mood, and things like whether you believe in capital punishment, your views about homosexuality, or indeed taking drugs. Those things will change, as we can show you, because when I was born, it was illegal to be gay. And in Britain today, 66% say it would be fine if Prince Harry had married a man rather than Meghan Markle. So very different world than the 1960s. Indeed, Meghan Markle might have been happy if she hadn't married Harry and he'd married a man. But anyway, that's another point. But if we look at this, we've looked here at some data from 20 years ago. So before 9/11, before Facebook, before the 2008 crash, when internet penetration in Britain was hardly anything. And if you look at these values, you can see there's the internet going from 13% to 93%. But here, the proportion saying everybody must work out their own set of principles hasn't changed. Wanting to slow down the pace of life, despite all of these gizmos and being always on with our smartphones, exactly the same number thought that before smartphones, really. Technical progress is destroying our lives. What it was in 1999, it is today. And being in charge or getting into a big job, fulfillment in life is a prominent position in your chosen career, hasn't changed. So I'm not saying that nothing changes, but we need to be careful about assuming that everybody's going to completely give up everything that mattered to them before and look at the world in a completely different way. There are some changes. This is data since 1989, so when communism still existed at the start of this period, and then of course it collapses, and then we have all of the tech and all of the events of the last 30 years. And what we can see here is obviously on things like sex and drugs, we have become more liberal. We've become a bit more hedonistic. That's absolutely clear. 40% said homosexual relations were wrong in 1989, 40% in 1989. That's fallen to 13%. But overall, and soft drugs and hard drugs, reactions to those have gone down. But the proportion you say it's wrong to have sex with somebody who's married to someone else, adultery, hasn't really shifted. Probably not a statistically significant change. So some things change and some things don't. In terms of the here and now, we have growing awareness that it's very unlikely the economy will recover quickly. Only a quarter in Britain, 43% in America, 4 out of 10 in Germany, only 19% in France, usually the most miserable people in any survey of this type, although the Spanish are now matching them. Will people be able to spend their way out of recession? Well, most people expecting the pandemic to have a personal financial impact on them, 71% in Britain, a little bit less in Germany, where they may have handled the virus better, but still a majority of the population virtually everywhere. In Britain, of course, economic optimism is now almost certainly the lowest it's been since 2008, 69% expecting further deterioration over the next year, which is pretty dramatic. And what we have seen in all of the countries that we survey, pretty much in Britain, in France, in Italy, is a rise to backing the leadership, a rally to the flag. And that, again, is typical in times of crisis. So even though governments have been good or bad, slow or fast at tackling the crisis, we've generally seen a rise in support for them. And in terms of how people are spending their time, and this is where I think we start to get to some signs about what might come next. So first of all, we've got lots of people saying they're spending more time with their kids, more time on social media, of course, and 80% of people telling us that they are getting closer to friends and relatives, the majority of people on the planet in our global surveys are telling us that they're spending more time talking to relatives, realizing perhaps who really matters in their lives. We also have lots more gardening and book reading in Britain among nearly all age groups, only 8% having more sex, although among the 18 to 34-year-olds, that's 17%. And then we've got sort of more traditional things like baking bread, doing some painting, knitting, decorating the house. Puzzles have seen a massive rise, which we'll come to. So all over the world, we can see these things. And if you're interested in what happened in China, do join our webinar on Wednesday, on the 22nd of April, where you can get a lot more detail about exactly what happened from the point of view of our Chinese colleagues who tracked in great detail China's experience in the pandemic, which shows some similar signs and some differences to what's happening in Britain. It's certainly true that we have a quarter of the population roughly saying they're doing more online banking, more grocery shopping, more general shopping online, of course, and the only limits to online grocery shopping seem to be the ability of the system to actually provide slots. I went on to try and get an Ocado order, and I think the first one I can get is in about 8 weeks' time because demand is now so high. So will that persist, or will people delight in going back to shops once everything's open again? We will see. What we do have, though, is support for Chinese-style surveillance. And this is interesting in the sense that many people, of course, have raised the privacy problems and said that some of the things that China did in order to flatten the curve of infection, or indeed to stop the spread of infection, was something that Western consumers wouldn't put up with. But actually, we've got 65% of people saying that the government should be able to track who's come into contact with somebody, so they can advise individuals to self-isolate themselves. We've got about half saying the government can find out where people are abroad. And also, if you're following social distancing and lockdown rules, so if your phone came within 2 meters of somebody else, or you left your house more than once a day, you might get penalised or fined. And 49% of the British population seem to support some sort of intervention like that. And on the face of it, this might be surprising. But one of the things that we found in the Global Trends report is actually rising data apathy, with 3/4 of people telling us that it's impossible, it's becoming less and less possible to have any privacy because of the technology that we're all part of. More and more people say they sign up for things without ever checking the privacy settings. And it appears that people are willing to sacrifice quite a lot of privacy in order to have some kind of ability to have a normal life. So let's see where this goes. But rising data apathy has been a thing. And when we looked at the whole issue of consumers and privacy, we looked for all the trend data we could find. We were looking, incidentally, at trust in media and trust in government. But we could only find one measure back in the early 1990s that we updated. And we found that in Europe, at least, people's concern about the privacy of their personal data was identical in 2019 as it was in 1992, before the internet really got going. So I think concern is always there, but so it would appear is apathy, and people ultimately want to use the technology. One thing that is clear is that even before CV19, one of the strongest values shared by people globally was this fear of the future. What I've done here is just rank all the values generated from those hundreds and hundreds of questions in the Global Trends survey, and you can see you've got climate emergency at the top, but also faith in medicine. You've got fear of the future, along with data apathy, and that actually was similarly matched to data anxiety. Discerning consumption and wealth redistribution. Unfortunately, faith in capitalism and tired of environmentalism a bit further down the chart. So you can see the things that really tend to unite the planet, and one of them is this anxiety about the future. In this country, where we are now, remember, before the crash, 12% of us at the beginning of the century said our children would be poorer than us. Last year in Britain, that figure was 45%. And now we are into a period where almost certainly there is going to be a massive squeeze on incomes for some time. And for millennials, it's particularly acute in that many of them come of age, of course, after 2000, in the aftermath of the 2008 crash. They get going of their lives and have children, and then this thing hits them. And it will be interesting, in particular, in our generational analysis that some of you will be familiar with, to see how that starts to play out at a generational level. Previously, millennials were the least trusting people in society. in part perhaps because of what they had been through, but we will be tracking it. So in terms of some of those key trends that we think it's worth focusing on, I mean, one is authenticity is king, people saying that they want to buy from brands that share their values. And brands, of course, standing out still as a key identifier, particularly in the developing world, slightly less so in say, Western Europe and America. We've got nostalgia, which was already there, but is, you've got 50% of the planet wanting their country to be the way it used to be. The place that is least likely to say that, China, 27%. Why? Because Chinese people, of course, can remember, will have relatives, will have folklore and stories of relatives and grandparents actually starving to death in the 1950s and early 1960s. In the West, of course, it's a very different thing. It doesn't mean we want to go back to the past and make homosexuality illegal again, but it does mean that that's likely to be here. We're seeing some signs of renewed nostalgia now. A key trend, of course, the search for simplicity and meaning. How do we make things simple and how do we give people meaning? And again, will we see a massive sort of reappraisal of people's lives and consumption? Consumers currently spending about 25% less on average than they did before the crash. All of those oat milk lattes, those lunches in places like Pret have gone. Did they make you happier buying clothes every week? Did it make you happier? People perhaps will reappraise. We have, even before COVID-19, 63% wanting their life to be simpler. So at the same time, of course, you've got that search for simplicity, and you've also got, well, if the future's threatening, then hedonism. This is the global trend between 2013 and 2020 on hedonism. The important thing is to enjoy life today. Tomorrow will take care of itself. 50, 52, 58. And for the young who were wondering what on earth was going to happen even before COVID-19, that was even stronger. So how could we use that framework of those 36 values, those 12 trends, to anticipate changes that we might see permanently from CV19? So I thought what we'd do is look at some of those signals. I mean, the first is climate antagonism. As the New York Times puts it, social distancing. You might be fighting climate change too. We've got the tension between Gen Z and boomers over climate change. It's not okay, boomer. But does that lead to more antagonism over these? Is it one of the values of the divided world that we saw, or do we think that actually people notice less pollution, cleaner air? Does that mean actually we don't want to go back to commuting all the time? Have we, do we actually quite like spending time just living a slightly simpler life? Will we see a world not wanting to see air travel resume its relentless upward path in the way that it had done, generally linked to GDP growth? So will there be more change, or will it be like 2008, whereas governments are so determined to drive economic growth at all costs, because they've got very angry voters to deal with, that they push on with massive construction, etc. And you see, as you saw in 2008, a rapid rise in emissions out of the recession. We don't know yet. Certainly, concern about climate change going into this crisis was far higher than in 2008. The tech dimension, obviously, we were already looking at. I think the fact that people have now decided they can live on Zoom and other softwares means that many of us have noticed that you can run a business without having everybody in the office. Do we decide that mass surveillance is also the way, plus a lot of testing, is the way out of this? And does this become a sort of lifestyle that becomes more normal? If, as some people have suggested, it was not SARS that was the warning about COVID-19, but actually COVID-19 is a warning about an even more infectious and deadly pandemic that could be coming. And of course, these types of things have been predicted for some time. So do we learn to love remote working and say, actually, we don't need to spend all that money we used to have to live in a big, expensive city where we and pay nearly all our wages in rent or in mortgage payments. We can live much further away, somewhere much cheaper, use Zoom, and perhaps come into the office once a week. And do companies then change their offices so that actually they become a hub where people meet occasionally, rather than where people sit between 9 and 5 p.m. every single day? Again, we don't know. And does surveillance become just a normal thing? We will see what happens as different governments in the West start to roll out more and more monitoring. But the signs are that the public would put up with it. We also, of course, have more inequality potentially coming. Society was unequal before, but certain groups in society are going to be harder hit than others. We may be creating, in terms of pouring money into the economy, an even bigger asset bubble than we had after the 2008 crash. So in terms of fear of the future, whether it's sort of self-isolating with vast amounts of toilet paper or thinking about things like traditional nationalism, we don't want those borders ever reopened. We don't ever want infection coming back in here. Do we see that? Or do we see perhaps a realization that the only way to deal with things like COVID-19 does mean a new form of multilateralism? We will have to do this together. Again, we don't know which way that goes. Protectionism or a decline in trade, which is what we saw in the 1930s, of course, after the crash of 1929. There are many similarities between what happened in 1929, at least in financial terms, and now. Or perhaps a more positive future. Again, we don't know. We could see a world where travel becomes a much more expensive process if a lot of airlines go to the wall, if countries are much more, if you have to be screened before you set off, monitored on apps as you go. Are we going to see that free-flowing travel of the last 20 years just gradually retreating, and it will go back to being like it was in the last century? What we certainly have seen is a rise in nostalgia, 500% increase in puzzles at home and board games, massive interest in lots of home cooking websites and Instagram. And what we saw after the 2008 crash, of course, was a retreat to cocooning in a sense, not forced to by a virus, but a retreat to the home, to simple, less expensive pleasures than going out. And it may mean, again, perhaps we decide that there's a certain fraction of the population decide they quite like just being at home, living a simple life. There's some signs in China after the lockdown has ended that people are so concerned about saving money because they're worried about the aftershocks on the economy that even when shops and restaurants reopen, they do not immediately return to a booming trade, and people retain the habits that they developed during the 80 days or so of lockdown in China. So again, we will be looking, do we see traditional, simple and cheaper alternatives, if you're furloughed on 80% of your pay, become more normalized and something that is a reversal of what we've seen in terms of the massive out-of-home eating of the last decade or so. One thing that we can see is authenticity is king, and what we can see is brands like General Mills pouring millions into marketing, because their evidence, of course, is that at times of crisis, people retreat to the brands that they knew as children, the tried and tested. We can also see brands exhibiting greater or lesser amounts of brand purpose. This is an example of one of the companies. This is Bavaria Beer Company, switching itself to make hand cleansing alcohol in the same way as LVMH has. Does that mean that it becomes even more important to show that you have some purpose as a brand? And do we see a sort of return to big and safe brands? It's really interesting. One of the signals we've picked up is Heinz now offering direct to consumer. So now you can tap into the brand of your mother, your grandfather, your grandmother, and you can have that direct relationship with it. So will we see big and safe brands winning in this new world? We certainly have more conscientious health, so there's a off the scales demand for Fitbits that you can use at home to measure your physical activity, all sorts of interesting in conscious eating, obviously lots more exercise at home, hundreds of thousands of people tuning in to fitness videos in a way that they didn't before. There's certainly overall awareness rising, people now sensitized to their health, they want to get ready in case they catch the virus. Does that sustain afterwards? It's certainly true that in terms of what we pay for healthcare, it will increase, where our healthcare systems are often found to lack resilience, as indeed have some of our national economies. And you can see suddenly thinking that running the NHS very efficiently without very many beds will probably be reversed, and it will be decided, we've done it literally by building 4,000 beds in the Nightingale Hospital in London, that sometimes having a few more beds, investing in resilience in supply chains and in healthcare is really, really important. So we've seen that change, but will people's awareness of their own health change, their own sensitivity? If we're constantly taking our temperatures or reporting in on apps how we're feeling, will we finally see healthcare systems move away from being illness services to being wellness services that some of us have been talking about for a long time? And then, of course, we also have capitalism's turning point. Wealth redistribution was very popular before COVID-19. Voters in Britain were told that there was no magic money tree, and it now turns out there is a magic money tree, and it's on steroids. So you've got governments all over the world, all over Europe, Germany, France, Britain, literally paying people's wages. How long does that go on for? Do we end up with a universal basic income? I personally don't think so, but certainly we're going to have a much bigger state than we have seen in recent years. We may see that people now expect the government to intervene when there is a recession in a much more dramatic way than they have in the past. We've noticed that austerity can now be reversed, which may lead to interesting arguments about whether we need it in the first place. In America, of course, we have the signs potentially that Americans might suddenly think that a universal healthcare system rather than an insurance system that leaves a third of Americans uncovered might be a good thing. So will we see much higher levels of taxation? Many people were predicting that higher taxes would have been necessary in the 2020s anyway in order to pay for public services of aging populations in the West. But certainly we are in a place that the politicians delivering many of these things would never in their wildest dreams imagine they would have been doing these things 3 months ago. So there we are. But the aftershocks of this will linger for a very long time. So predictions are certainly hard. Big data is watching you. I think in terms of what is clear, I'd go with Darwin. It will be the most adaptable brands and organisations that survive. It won't necessarily be the biggest. And the challenges we face in the sense we still have climate emergency. Do we refocus on that together? We've got no agreement globally on response, but it is the one value in our survey that unites the world in terms of what people agree on. We have data anxiety and worry that technology is destroying our lives, particularly among the young, but we also have plenty of signs of rising data apathy. We've got this very strong loss of the future that was present even before COVID-19. Do we see a tipping point into creating a new one or just sitting back and watching what happens? Will that mean more challenges to elites? There are certainly some scenarios that could see more political instability as a result of a long-term squeeze on incomes. We've got people now being reappraising the importance of local shopping, and not global supply chains. Will we see supply chains shorten and contract? Does that mean reshoring in a big way? How does that look? We have that sort of search for simplicity and health, which we can see, if anything, being strengthened by the lockdown and the aftermath of that. But we also have other escapism and rising hedonism. So which one wins, or are they both? Do you have both of them? Simplicity and health Monday to Friday, hedonism on Friday and Saturday. We have that general search for authenticity, but also, of course, the challenge for most brands and an authenticity on the part of politicians, but of course, ongoing skepticism. So those are some of the conundrum. I've given you literally the sort of very tip of the iceberg in taking you through global trends and COVID-19. If you're interested, do have a look at the website, Ipsos Global Trends, email UK Trends and Futures. We can arrange a virtual presentation or a virtual workshop. We'll give you access to the portal where you can cut all 370 questions you can compare people with tattoos in France with people with tattoos in China, see how their views compare on 370 different issues. It's all there. The website is free to air with the report. You can dig into COVID-19, how it's impacting our lives. Look for some of the signals that we're mapping out on the website. So there's Heinz opening its direct shop. I do like the traditional Chinese medicine treatment for COVID-19 uses bear bile, which may come from the sort of wet market where the whole disease came from. But anyway, what do I know? There's McDonald's redesigning its logo in Brazil to incorporate social distancing. So we've mapped out dozens of these signals for you to have a look at to see which ones might apply to you. As I say, there's a webinar at 9 a.m. on Wednesday the 22nd, looking at Chinese life under COVID-19 and what seems to have changed and what hasn't changed. I do hope you found that useful. And as I say, lots more on the website. And let us know what you think. We will run more of these. If there's particular aspects you want to hear about, do get in touch. Thank you so much.